Perhaps when you think of Calvin, you think, or Calvinism, you think of tulip. So you've heard of that before, or if not, we're going to go over it in just a second. It's the so-called 5 points. We're not even to the notes yet, so don't worry about the notes just yet. So actually, tulip comes from a 17th century. So Calvin was born in 1509, so much after he was around. And the whole point of the 5 points of Calvinism was, to argue against Arminianism, which had 5 points. And so the 5 points, or tulip, is more of a defense than anything, and it's not necessarily Calvin himself. There's plenty of copies, so help yourself. So on that handout, it goes through the 5 points of Arminianism and what the Calvinists would say after that. The other obvious clue that it wasn't Calvin that came up with tulip is because he was French, and you don't spell tulip, T-U-L-I-P. That's an English word. So this was done much later. The Synod of Dort is the conference. It was held in the Netherlands that was organized specifically to answer those 5 points. So that's yours to keep. Pretty good study. And at the bottom, it gives a synopsis of each one. Calvin was never really said much about himself. So although there was a ton of information to go through, a lot of it wasn't from him. He was a shy, humble type. In fact, Calvin had always warned against describing him as an idol, and Geneva, where he did a lot of his preaching, is the New Jerusalem, which were popular ideas. He encouraged people to adapt to the environment in which they found themselves. So don't look to him. Certainly he was another man that would point to the Lord. He was so humble, in fact, when he died, he had strict orders to be buried in an unmarked grave. He was a clear writer and a man who stuck to the text. He had enemies and was never truly beloved. While he was accepted and acknowledged, he wasn't loved. His clarity won them over. That's what got his status, is the way he preached, the way he taught, the way he wrote. Ironically, is so many popular misconceptions, Calvin only had 5 points. That would be like saying there's only 10 commandments. So if you go through, there's like over 600 commandments. We just study the 10. Those are the popular ones, if you will, or they're all right in a row. So to say Calvin only had 5 points is much like that. We'll go over it a bit, but his writings, he expanded them years afterwards. So much of what I learned from Calvin is because of a guy named Theodore Beza, which was his right-hand man and his successor, as well as Nicholas Collodin, who was a friend back in the time. So each one of them wrote a biography about Calvin, and that's where a lot of the information comes. Certainly he wrote a little of himself, or we could take away a little from him in the books that he wrote. So, who was he? In his early life, Calvin was born July 10th, 1509, in Noyen, a town in Picardy, a province of the King of France. And as we go through this evening, we'll see that he did not live a long life. He passed at the early age of about 54, 55. Back then, the expectancy was closer to 71 if you made it out of infancy. So there was certainly many births that the life was short-lived because of infancy deaths back then, but the average age was around 71, so he was 20 years shy of that. He was an influential French theologian, pastor, reformer during the Protestant Reformation. He was a key figure in the development of system of Christian theology, part of what we now call Calvinism, so that word, the handout there. It includes things like the doctrine of predestination and the absolute sovereignty. So I think that might be one of the first ones there, sovereignty of God in salvation of the human soul from death and eternal damnation. Calvin was an apologetic writer who, through the course of his life, caused much controversy, and in many cases, as I went through, is probably much needed controversy. As we learned last summer and even beginning this summer, some of our heroes of the faith were the ones that went against what the church said. So Calvin was another one that did such things. He was the first of 4 sons that survived infancy. His mother, Jeanne Lefranc, was the daughter of an innkeeper. She died of an unknown cause in Calvin's childhood. Something to point out here as I did my best French accent was Calvin isn't his birth name, but it's what we know him as because it's the English translation of what his last name was. So the mother died when he was a child after having borne 4 more children. Calvin's father, Gerard, had a prosperous career as a cathedral notary and registered to the ecclesiastical court. He died in 1531 after suffering for 2 years from cancer. Gerard had intended for Calvin and his 3 brothers to all go into the priesthood. So young Calvin, at the ripe old age of 12, was employed by the bishop as a clerk and received the tonsure, which is a cutting of a hair. We probably most notably know it as the monk cut, where they're bald on the top and just a ring around there, and that was supposed to represent the crown of thorns that Christ wore. That was why they cut their hair that way. So he was encouraged and sponsored by an influential family, the Montmours, and through their assistance, Calvin was able to attend the Collège de la Marche, which is in Paris, France. He learned Latin from one of the greatest Latin teachers of the time. So not by coincidence, as we all know, that's by God's providence. He completed the course and he entered another college as a philosophy student, and we'll learn later that that all of the learnings, all of the teaching, the education he had will build up to who he was. So around 1525, shortly after he had gone to the second college to study philosophy, his father withdrew him from college and enrolled him in the University of Orleans to study law. So it was a scholastic college. It was more of a rigid study. It's thought that Gerard believed that Calvin would earn more money as a lawyer than as a priest. So there's also some information that suggests his father had a falling out with the church. Remember, he had a pretty high position in the church, and so there's some thought that that was his motivation to pull Calvin away from the priesthood. Something to keep in mind, and why they think that, is in those days, it's not like we think of today's priest's salary versus a lawyer's salary today. So, the truth and the facts are that the Catholic Church was loaded, right? So to say a priest couldn't be rich, that's not the case. Back then they were. In addition, the law generally supported everything the church said because the church dictated it. So those two factors kind of conflict as to why he might have been pulled away from that and suggest perhaps there was some controversy there. So after a few years of study, Calvin entered the University of Bourges in 1529. He started under a guy named Andreas Ciati. He was a humanist lawyer. So humanism was... Humanism was a European intellectual movement. It stressed on classical studies, so the traditions, and not the rigid, textbook study. During his 18 months in Bourges, Calvin learned Koine Biblical Greek, which I'm sure if Paul were here, I'd blew it, but it's basically the Greek in the Bible, which would prove to be beneficial in his studies of the New Testament later on. He's originally trained as a humanist lawyer, so therefore, because of that classical study training, he broke away from the Roman Catholic Church traditions around 1530. Let's see. By 1532, Calvin had received his license in law and published his first book, and it was a commentary. During the autumn of 1533, Calvin experienced a religious conversion. In latter life, he wrote 2 significantly different accounts of his conversion. In the first account, found in his commentary on the book of Psalm, Calvin portrayed his conversion as a sudden change of mind brought about by God. He wrote this: God, by a sudden conversion, subdued and brought my mind to a teachable frame, which is more hardened in such matters than might have been expected from one at my early period of life. Having thus received some taste and knowledge of true godliness, I was immediately inflamed with so intense a desire to make progress therein that although I did not altogether leave off other studies, yet I pursued them with less ardor. In the second account, Calvin wrote a process of inner turmoil followed by spiritual and psychological anguish. So there's two differences there. In that account, he writes this: being exceedingly alarmed at the misery into which I had fallen, and much more at the which threatened me in view of eternal death, I duty-bound made it my first business to betake myself to your way, condemning my past life, not without groans and tears, and now, O Lord, what remains to a wretch like me, but instead of defense, earnestly to supplicate you not to judge that fearful abandonment of your word, according to its deserts, from which in your wondrous goodness you have last delivered me. So if I'm granted the creative license to say that those are different, then I would argue that we all have that same conversion of that moment's notice where you're sitting here or wherever it was. For me, it was here on a Sunday. And the pastor said something, and it was that raise your hand moment. I don't know what happens to me next. That was that instant change that the Holy Spirit had given me. But then, fast forward to now, 10 plus years later, I still work at it every day, knowing that I'm a sinner, knowing that I mess it up. And so there was still that arduous journey. So I think when Calvin says, in one account, it happened instantly, and in another account, it's been a long process, we could all have that same account, that's us. We have that instant change, but it doesn't give us instant knowledge, and so we work through all of those things. After religious, let's see, make sure the slides are, sorry, there we go. So after religious tensions erupted in a widespread deadly violence in the Protestant church, so there's all the confusion going on in France, Calvin fled to Basel, Switzerland. That was in March 1536. At the age of 27, he published his first edition of the Institutes of the Christian Religion. You can find that still on YouTube today. So if you want to listen to something, now I will tell you I tried to listen to the whole thing, but you can't do two things at once. It's deep, and there's a lot to it, and it's long. So if you're interested and you want to read about Calvin's writings, you can find that right on YouTube. The work was a defense of his faith and a statement of the doctrinal position of the Reformers. He also intended to serve as an elementary instruction book for anyone interested in the Christian faith. The book was his first expression of theology. Calvin updated it through his entire life. There was many different renditions. Each time he updated it, it didn't change much. So as the years went on, from a young man all the way to the end of his life, it was pretty much the same thing. It started out only having 6 chapters. In 1539, there was a second edition, and this was 3 times as long. So because he just simply added chapters to it, but it was expounding on, again, his faith and what he believed and what he was reading and learning. In 1543, he again added in material and expounded upon it and added chapters in the Apostles' Creed. So the final edition of the Institutes appeared in 1559, and by then it was consisted of 4 books and 80 chapters. So a 6-chapter book, by the time he's done in his 50-plus years of life, it's an 80-chapter book, a little bit different than where he started. In the same year, 1536, that he wrote that book, he was recruited by a Frenchman, and the Frenchman's name was William Farel. And William Farel had convinced him to stay and work with him and help him to work on the Reformed faith and the teachings and all that went with it. Calvin's initial plan was to stay for 1 day. He was only going to be there for 1 day. He ended up spending nearly his entire life there afterwards. He wrote this after reluctantly remaining. This is what he wrote about Farel. Then Farel, who was working with incredible zeal to promote the gospel, bent all his efforts 1 day. So I find it amusing that he had a plan to move on from here and only be there a day, and all of his zeal he spent in 1 day. That was enough to change his mind. But it goes on. This kind of talks about his character, his humble, his shy. He says, he spent 1 day to keep me in the city. And when he realized I was determined to study in privacy in some obscure place and saw that he gained nothing by entreaty, he descended to cursing and said that God would surely curse my peace if I held back from giving help at a time such a great need. Terrified by his words and conscious of my own timidity and cowardness, I gave up my journey and attempted to apply whatever gift I had in defense of my faith. So his intentions were to be off in solitude and just learn, study, and grow on his own. And this Pharaoh fella says, nah, that's not what you're here for, to the point of cursing him and basically guilting him into staying where he stayed and worked for years and years. 1537, he was selected as a pastor, although he never received a consecration as a pastor. There's that comment that he had wrote. By September of 1538, Calvin had taken up his new position in Strasbourg. So there was tension, and they had to move on, but the two of them were together, fully expecting that this time it would be permanent. A few months after getting there, he applied and was granted citizenship to the city. So during his time in Strasbourg, Calvin was not attached to any particular church. So he preached in many of them. He held an office in St. Nicholas Church, the St. Madeleine Church, the former Dominican Church, which was renamed the Temple of Neuf Calvin. But he ministered to 400 to 500 people in the church. He preached or lectured every day with 2 sermons on Sunday. Communion was celebrated monthly, and the congregational singing of the Psalms was encouraged. So this was something that was new, and Calvin was one that had quite a bit to do with it. He worked on the second edition of his Institutes there at that time, and Calvin was dissatisfied with its original structure as a catechism. So originally when he wrote it, he thought it would be a good way to teach the kids, but he decided to expand on it. And as we stated earlier, we're talking 80 chapters later. So I did mention, and I wanted to go over it a little bit, his use of the song. So he included hymns that he liked. I'm just going to read one of them to you real quick because I enjoyed just reading it. It says, "You faithful servants of the Lord." I believe they labeled it the 100th Psalm, and I forgot to look and make sure it was still our 100th Psalm, but it says, "You faithful servants of the Lord, sing out of his praise one accord, while serving him with all your might and keeping vigil through the night. Unto his house lift up your hand, and to the Lord your praises send. May God, who made the earth and sky, bestow his blessing from on high." That was the one that Calvin liked most. All right, so back. So this kind of speaks to his character. His friends urged him to marry. And Calvin took a less than excited view, and he wrote to one of his correspondents this. Probably best that Michelle's not here. Well, this is his words, not mine. "I, who have the air of being so hostile to celibacy, I am still not married, and do not know whether I will ever be. If I take a wife, it will be because, being better freed from numerous worries, I can devote myself to the Lord." So Calvin's idea of a wife was somebody who could take care of all the worries so that he could simply work with the Lord. His friends were so diligent that we'll stay right there for a minute. They had several candidates for him to be married to. One of them was a noble family. He reluctantly agreed to marry her, but then at the last minute, the plans fell through. He ends up later marrying, Idelette. It's French, forgive me. So he later writes that he was marrying her he wouldn't marry unless the Lord entirely bereft me of my wits. So instead, when he did marry, he married a lady. She had 2 kids from a previous marriage, he never having any of his own. After her passing, he never did marry again, but he wrote this: "I have been bereaved of the best friend of my life, of one who, if has been so ordained, would willingly have shared not only my poverty, but also my death. During her life, she was the faithful helper of my ministry. From her, I never experienced the slightest hindrance." So I'm saving that one for I need to write Michelle a thank you or a wife card of some sort, because I figure that's a pretty good one to throw out there. I've never experienced the slightest hindrance. So moving on, in support of Calvin's proposals for the reforms, this is the Council of Geneva passed the ecclesiastical ordinances on the 20th of November in 1541. So the ordinances defined 4 orders of the ministerial function. Pastors, and they were to preach and administer the sacraments. Doctors, to instruct believers in the faith. I believe that's another word for teachers of our day. Elders, to provide discipline. And deacons, to care for the poor and the needy. They also called the creation of the consistory an ecclesiastical court. It composed of lay elders. So even today we have our deacon board that is composed of folks not necessarily hired into the church, but just the lay people. The city government retained the power of the summons. The city government retained the power to summon persons before the court, and the consistory could judge only ecclesiastical matters having no civil jurisdiction. Originally, the court had the power to deliver the sentences, but with excommunication being the most severe. However, later the government contested that the power was too much and took it back from them, deciding that sentencing would be carried out only by the government, which made me think you got to love the government. So Calvin's in his final years of life. Calvin's authority was practically uncontested. He enjoyed an international reputation as a reformer, distinct from Martin Luther. Initially, Luther and Calvin had a mutual respect for each other. However, a doctrinal conflict developed between Luther and another fellow from Zurich. His name is there, and you can read it. So it was on the interpretation of the Eucharist. So Calvin's opinion on the issue forced Luther to place him in the Zillwiggis camp, saying now that there was a difference between the two of them. Calvin actively participated in debates and was exchanged between Luther and Reformed branches of the Reformation movement. So there was definitely a back and forth between the two. And if you remember earlier, when I read the beginnings of Luther's statements, it didn't seem all that far off. One of the things that Calvin struggled with was the Reformed group was one in which they weren't all the same. There wasn't a unity to them. And that was one of the things that he worked hard to do. In the autumn of 1558, Calvin became ill with a fever. Since he was afraid that he might die before completing his final revision of the Institutes, he forced himself to work. The final edition was greatly expanded to the extent that Calvin referred to it as the new work. The expansion from what was previously in the third edition, 21 chapters, was now up to 80, was due to the extended treatment of existing material. It wasn't necessarily new topics that he was adding. It was simply expounding on the ones that were already there. So shortly after he recovers from this illness that he thought was going to take him out, he strained his voice while preaching, which brought on a violent fit of coughing, to the point where he burst a blood vessel in his lung, and his health steadily declined from there. He preached his final sermon, St. Pierre, on February 6, 1564. And then on April 25th, he made his will, in which he left small sums of money to his family and to the college. A few days later, the ministers came to the church to visit him and gave their final farewell. It was recorded. There we go. Okay. So it was recorded, and he recounted his life in Geneva, sometime recalling the bitterness and how harsh it was, the hardships that he suffered. Calvin died on the 27th of May, 1564, at the age of about 54 years old. At first, his body lay in a state, but since so many people came to see it, the reformers that were there at the time were afraid that a new movement and a cult would be formed. So, and again, if you recall, his wishes were to be buried in an unmarked tomb. So that's what they ended up doing. They buried him in that unmarked tomb. The exact location of the grave is unknown today, and later a stone was added in the 19th century to mark a grave traditionally thought as Calvin's, but even still, it's not that the case. So, who was Calvin? That's about all we know about him. There is that picture. Obviously, the photography wasn't as good as it is today. There's so much in his writing. I mean, we're talking about an individual who started with a 6-chapter book and ended up being 4 different volumes. He preached with no notes, and so they attempted to record his sermons, and they couldn't keep up. So the writing wasn't good. It was sketchy. They went on to later, an individual who knew some sort of shorthand tried to do it that way, so there are still some there. But everything that he did was from the Bible. It was straight and clear, and as I mentioned earlier, that he was clear. He had a lot of different travels in his life, where he was in Strasbourg and Geneva. He was moving around, but primarily he was known for his work in Geneva. At one point, he was actually in Strasbourg doing his teaching, and that was where, if you recall, he had asked to be a citizen there. But the church had run out of people to preach in Geneva, and they were looking to get somebody back. And although they had run him out earlier in his life, the numbers were dwindling in the church, so they called him back, and he agreed for a 6-month period of time to go back there and do that. So even the people that didn't like him respected him and knew who he was and how great he was, even at that time. But they still didn't truly enjoy and understand what they were listening to and how amazing of a man he was. So I think a lot of times when you hear the term Calvinism, you just simply assume that was Calvin's writings and teachings, but that term also didn't come until much later. It was based on a lot of the information that we have now today from his writings, but it wasn't anything. He by no means would ever want a movement named after him. Again, he was only 54 years old when he passed, so a young man. He started out working at the age of 12, so he had a long career in that regard. But he certainly was a unique individual, and one that was an amazing hero as we're going through of his time, but not noticed at the moments of, other than the respect factor. And that's John Calvin.